the website shortly afterwards. So welcome to this event, Sticks, Carrots and the Occasional Nudge. Should social security policy be focused on trying to change behaviour? My name's Anoosh Chakelian. I'm Britain editor of the new Statesman, where I've been covering welfare policy for years. And I'm delighted to be joined by our panelists today. And thanks so much to our audience as well for coming. And if you want to tweet, and we do encourage you to tweet along, please use the hashtag Sticks and Carrots. The event is part of the Benefit Changes and Larger Families research programme, kindly funded by the Nuffield Foundation. And we're very grateful to the foundation for making this event possible. And it's such an important discussion to be had, particularly at this moment when so many poor people engaged with the universal credit system during the pandemic, and as more and more people are pushed into precarious financial situations and poverty as inflation rises. Should a safety net ever be conditional in these circumstances? And to what extent should social security policy be used to try and change people's behaviour, particularly in an economic situation as we have now, which is exposing more than ever how the reduction of poverty is beyond any individual's control? There will be a Q&A at the end of the session, and I'll let you know when that is, and you can post your questions in the chat. But for now, we are going to hold the first of two polls. So I'll hand over to Ruth for holding that first poll.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Anoosh, and thank you for chairing. So if the technology works, in a minute, I'm going to launch the first poll, and you'll have about 30 seconds to vote on it. And just to flag, it's a multiple choice, so you can select as many of the options as you like. And also just to flag that if you're a panelist, you sadly aren't allowed to vote, and I don't make the rules. I guess it's Zoom that makes those rules, that they don't let webinar panelists vote on their own polls. So I'll give it a little bit to run and then I'll stop. But I guess it is a bit like, does everyone remember Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, where you have to, it's kind of fastest fingers first or almost. But also what's nice is it means that I'll be able to share the results with you as well. So I'll let it run for just another 10 or so seconds. I can see people are trying to make up their mind. We've still got a few more to vote. And just to say as well, while I'm letting that run for a couple of seconds more, in terms of the Q&A, as Anoosh says, the Q&A is at the end, but if questions occur to you as people are speaking, do stick them in the Q&A, which is kind of appears at the bottom of your screen, and then we can take them at the end. Okay, so I think there's a few that haven't made up their mind, but I am going to end the poll round about now. Okay, and then I think I can share the results. So if I share results, hopefully you guys can see that. So that's interesting already to see that we have only 7% saying that changing behaviour should be a key objective of the social security policy, and a much larger proportion talking about it tackling poverty, 87%, and then 74% saying it should redistribute resources across the income spectrum, and only 1% saying it should reduce public spending by restricting the amount spent on benefit payments. But quite a lot, so 59% saying it should redistribute resources across the life course. So I'll stop sharing and hand back to you, Anoosh.
Thanks so much, Ruth. Really interesting results there, and it will be interesting to see whether our panelists reflect on those at all too in their comments. So first of all, we're going to hear from Wendy, who is a full-time carer and parent. She's taken part in the Benefit Changes and Larger Families research programme, and will share her experiences of the 2-child limit in particular and the impact in general of Sticks and Carrots. Thank you so much, Wendy.
Okay, so hello, my name is Wendy and I'm a full-time unpaid carer to my disabled husband and 2 of our children who are autistic. I'm a mum to 8 children, 3 boys, 5 girls, and they range from 24 all the way down to 2. And we're affected by the 2-child limit, and we get nothing for our 3 and 2-year-old daughters. When we had baby number 7, we knew we wouldn't get any child tax for her. We hadn't planned on having any more children, not because of the limit, but because we'd got 6 and that's enough for anybody. But when my test came back positive, we never doubted about carrying on with the pregnancy. Financially, having baby number 7 impacted a little. We had to alter where we shopped and watch the pennies, but I breastfed and I used leftovers when it came to weaning her. The biggest expense was her clothes, and they all came from charity shops or her gifts. She never had anything brand new. Like I said, I was breastfeeding and we were using contraception. So when baby number 7 was about 6 months old and hubby was saying I was pregnant because I was grumpy, I did a test to just shut him up, and it shut me up because it came back positive, and I was actually 15 weeks pregnant. So even if I'd wanted to, which we didn't, we couldn't have ended the pregnancy anyway. Having baby number 8 put enormous pressure on our budget, even before the cost of living crisis. It's affected every aspect of our spending, down to I can afford to buy 24 toilet rolls a month. So if somebody's poorly or has a dodgy tummy, then I go without food to buy more toilet roll, and I'm diabetic, so that's not a great start. I have to take out budgeting loans for shoes and clothes. I've had to borrow money from family for basic essentials. Christmas and birthdays are paid on catalogues and the Never Never. I know that we are not alone in finding out that you're pregnant after 12 weeks. I know of 3 families that this has happened to in the last year alone, all affected by the child limit, and at least one of those families would have ended the pregnancy if they'd have found out sooner, purely on financial reasons. This policy discriminates people on so many levels, between rich and poor, between men and women. Statistics show the majority of single parents are women, so they get penalised for having 2 children. Rich people can have endless amounts of children, poorer people, 2. This policy is also putting women in a position of having to choose between having a child, which would stretch their finances, or a termination. Either way, huge decision that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. I'm a passionate believer in what we put into our children, we get back later on. My 3 adult children are all working full time. 2 have left home and rent. The one still at home is saving for a deposit, but she drives. So they're putting back into the system. Children need investing in. If you leave a child in poverty, then statistically they will underachieve their whole life. And that's what this policy is condemning children to. Children need love, warmth, care, and food in their tummies. And families are struggling to provide these basic things. And what is so heartbreaking is there is such an easy solution to reduce this. I have yet to meet one person who thinks, ka-ching, we're going to get extra money for having a baby. A baby is a commitment for life that no government will pay what it actually costs to raise a child. No child asks to be born, especially into poverty. So this policy is punishing a child for something they had no control over. Also, it said that people are 1 to 2 pay packets away from financial ruin. When we had our 4 older children, Chris was working until he suffered an injury, at which point I went back to work, and I continued working until Chris needed more care at home. When Chris worked, he earned an excellent wage and we needed no help from anyone, and we were entitled to nothing. Luckily, when we both had to stop working, there was a system in place that helped us. If that happened today, then we would receive tax credit for just 2 of our children. This policy applies to people who've been made redundant, separated from their partners, those fleeing domestic violence, or even if a partner dies. So people saying, oh, you shouldn't have children if you can't afford them is meaningless, because when you have them, you can afford them, but then life happens and things change. Scrapping this policy would not only bring millions of children out of poverty, but it would improve the mental health and well-being of families too. Laying in bed at night trying to work out if you've enough money to get some bread so the children can at least have toast for breakfast and dinner. People are not thinking about where should we go on a fancy holiday with this government money. They're thinking, if I put £10 on the electric meter, have I got enough to buy food and toilet roll? We are one of the richest nations in this world. We shouldn't have any child living in poverty, and the fact that we have millions and the government have the ability to change this is outrageous. And I believe this policy needs to be scrapped, and it needs to be done sooner rather than later, because we need to invest in our children, not punish them.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I'm sure everyone would agree that that was very powerfully put. Thank you. And now I am going to move on to Dr. Kate Anderson, Research Associate at the University of York, and Mary Reader, Research Officer at the London School of Economics, who are part of the Benefit Changes and Larger Families Research Programme. And they'll be talking now about the effect of the 2-child limit on fertility.
Great, thanks so much, Anoosh, and for having us, and for everyone for coming. what we're going to do is present some ongoing research about the impact of the policy that Wendy so powerfully talked about just now, the 2-child limit, on fertility decision-making and fertility behaviours. Yeah, this is ongoing work as part of the Changes and Larger Families project, who are hosting this project. So just first of all, to set it in context, this is a large mixed methods research project funded by the Nuffield Foundation, and we're looking specifically at the impact of recent welfare reforms on larger families, which here we define as families with more than 3 or more children. And we're focusing particularly in the project on the 2-child limit and the benefit cap. We're using mixed methods, so combining qualitative longitudinal research with quasi-experimental quantitative techniques. And in the QLR, what we're doing is walking alongside 44 families who are affected by these policies over a period of 18 months. And that includes Wendy's family, who just spoke to us. And you can find out more about our publications on our website. So first of all, I'm sure this will be familiar to many of you, but for those of you who it's not, or just as a refresher, what is the 2-child limit? Well, essentially, since the 6th of April 2017, means tested child benefits in the form of the child element of universal credit and the child tax credit have not been payable for children who were born after that date into families with 2 or more existing children. And so that's the main mechanism through child element, but it also affects a number of other benefits which are listed here. Notably, however, it does not affect child benefit. All children can continue to receive child benefit. And it was announced by then Chancellor George Osborne in the July 2015 budget. The main central aim of the 2-child limit, as proposed by the government, was to ensure that families in receipt of benefits, and I quote, face the same financial choices about having children as those supporting themselves solely through work. And implicit in that were a number of assumptions about the link between social security and financial support and fertility decision making. And we think it's at least justifiable that there was an implicit aim here of disincentivizing families from having more than 2 children if they were on benefits, or at the very least, certainly influencing their fertility decision making and making them think more, in quote marks, about the decision to have an additional child. And this came through very strongly in David Cameron's welfare speech in 2012, in which he said, quite simply, we have been encouraging working age people to have children and not work, when we should be enabling working age people to work and have children. So it's time to ask some serious questions about the signals we send out through the benefit system. But though this was implied in many cases, and the government did anticipate a decline in fertility, as it evidenced in its impact assessment, in which it said people may in practice respond to the incentives this policy provides and have fewer children, it has denied that it is trying to explicitly stop people from having children, which is perhaps unsurprising for political reasons. In response to the Work and Pension Select Committee, who criticised the policy's aim to reduce fertility, the government claimed this policy does not attempt to limit the number of children people have. Claimants are able to have as many children as they choose in the knowledge of the support available. But ultimately, we believe that irrespective of whether it's an implicit or an explicit aim, the policy was certainly framed as about incentivizing greater responsibility in fertility decision making. And so we feel it's really relevant to this central question of, should the government be trying to initiate behavioural change, and what happens when it does so within this realm of fertility. I'm going to present the quantitative research findings from what we found about this question, and then I'm going to hand over to Kate. So essentially, the question we're trying to answer here is whether the 2-child limit, whether there's any quantitative causal evidence that this reduced fertility among larger families. And in order to answer that with the data available, essentially what we do is compare fertility rates among those who are affected by the 2-child limit, which is, broadly speaking, women on benefits or couples on benefits with 2 or more children, and compare those to other kind of comparable groups who weren't affected. And I'm going to be quite short on methods for this webinar. If you want to find out more, do read our working paper, which has been published and is available online. But essentially what we do is, is we compare the fertility trends among those affected by the 2-child limit with 3 other groups of women who are not affected. And this is called a triple differences approach, which essentially enables us to control for more general trends in fertility that aren't attributable to the 2-child limit. And we do this drawing on a really rich set of data from administrative birth records and survey data as well. This graph basically is the kind of main takeaway from the paper, which shows the probability of having a child for 4 different groups over time. And the group that are affected by the 2-child limit is the line with the filled in dots and the solid line, which you can see here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but essentially after the introduction of the policy in 2017, we see something of a decline in the probability of having an additional child among larger families on benefits. And we don't see that among other groups. However, if you look at the magnitude of the effects here, it's really very small and unlikely to be statistically significant. In short, we find that the probability declines by approximately 0.36 percentage points, which is about 5,600 births a year. And the question is, how big is that? Well, first of all, compared to existing literature, it's much smaller than the effects that have been documented elsewhere, for example, by Mike Brewer and colleagues, who found that expansions in the generosity of benefits during the noughties led to relatively large increases in fertility. And the elasticities implied from that are about 3 times as large as the ones that we derive. And the second way of putting that in context is comparing it to the impact on children. And we know from estimates from Child Poverty Action Group that approximately 50,000 children are pushed into poverty every year by the 2-child limit, and that will increase exponentially as more and more children are born into this policy environment. So 5,600 births a year not happening, but 50,000 definitely being pushed into poverty. And you might ask, why such a small effect? You know, it's a big amount of money to be losing. It's nearly £3,000 a year to be losing per child. And that's a really good question. But unfortunately, with the quantitative data, we're not really able to answer that. So I'm going to pass over to Kate, who might be able to reflect on some of these mechanisms with the QLR.
Thanks, Mary. So in order to explore the fertility effects and to try and understand them a bit, Ruth and I have looked at the government literature on the 2-child limit, for example, the impact assessments, and then compared the assumptions we found in those documents with the findings from the Benefit Changes and Larger Families project, from the qualitative longitudinal strand of the project. So before I go into those findings, I'll just give a quick overview of our fieldwork to date. So last year we conducted 45 interviews, and 20 of those participants were affected by the 2-child limit, 14 were affected by the 2-child limit and the benefit cap, and 11 participants by just the benefit cap. So the findings today is drawing on the interviews from the 34 participants affected by the 2-child limit. And the table here just gives a bit of an idea of the characteristics of the sample. So we're just finishing up round 2 of our interviews with the same participants, and we'll do another round later in the year. So a first assumption that we can see in the government literature is that people are aware of the 2-child limit and the impact it will have. So the impact assessment says entitlement will remain at the level for 2 children for households who make the choice to have more children in knowledge of the policy. But this didn't match up with our findings. We found that about half of the participants were not aware of the 2-child limit when the directly affected child was conceived. So some people were already claiming benefits, and they didn't know until either they were pregnant or until they gave birth, like Laura. So when she phoned up to report that she'd had her 3rd child, she says that she was just so shocked because she didn't realise at all before then that she wouldn't be getting child elements for her 3rd child. And then there were other participants like Ifemelu who weren't claiming benefits when she got pregnant. So it wasn't until her youngest child was 2 that she realised that there was a child limit. So for some people, it would just be very difficult, if not impossible, to know about the 2-child limits. Next. Slide, please, Mary. Another assumption is that all conceptions are the result of choice. So again, the impact assessment says that the main people groups affected by the policy will be those in receipt of tax credits or universal credit who choose to have a third or subsequent child after April 2007. But again, unsurprisingly, this just didn't really match up with everyday experiences. We found there were numerous occasions of contraception failures and unplanned pregnancies. So Kadra, for example, explained, I had the coil, I fell pregnant, and I had the implant, I fell pregnant. But it's not something that I did on purpose. So she's referring here to her 5th and her 6th children, and she doesn't get the child element for either of those children. And then really sadly, some of the participants conceived the affected child in the context of an abusive relationship, or it was a non-consensual conception. So Kalima explained, obviously me being pregnant, it weren't something I wanted. The situation with him had to go to court because there was abuse in the relationship. And while there are exemptions in the 2-child limit legislation for cases like this, clearly many women aren't receiving them. And for us, some of the participants were saying it was because of the verification process they have to go through to get that exemption. Next slide, please. Thank you. A third assumption is that people can predict whether or not they'll need to claim social security support in the future. The Work and Pensions Committee did a report and they said really only the very wealthy could have a third or subsequent child in these circumstances, knowing that they wouldn't need to claim benefits in the future. The government responded by saying, if you could just go back, Mary. Thanks. Families who are not previously claiming benefits have made decisions about the affordability of life choices in the knowledge that their financial and other circumstances could change over time. But again, this didn't match up with what we found. So we found that participants made the choice whether or not to have the affected child based on current circumstances rather than potential future circumstances. So Jessica explained that she was financially stable and in a relationship when they conceived the affected child. And then, of course, that relationship subsequently broke down, which meant that she was really affected by the 2-child limit. And of course, the pandemic, again, has served as such a stark reminder how quickly and unpredictably life can change. So Miriam was working for the pandemic and lost her job during it, and then was really affected by the 2-child limit, which again just shows how things can change that are completely unpredictable and completely out of people's control. Next slide, please, Mary. A fourth assumption is that people can make choices about whether or not they have children based upon what they can afford. So the government said that the policy will ensure that those on benefits face the same financial choice around the number of children they can afford as those through work. But again, we found that while financial considerations can be a factor as to whether or not to have an additional child, there are other reasons, other bases for making that decision. Next slide, please. So when we asked Kelly, did the 2-child limit impact on your decision to have a third child? She said, not really, no. I always wanted a little boy, so I thought, just try one more time. And I finally got my little boy. And Hamid explained that for him and his wife, he wasn't looking at the 2-child limit in the same way as the government because he was Muslim, basically. So he had very different ideas about fertility decisions and the basis on which they're made. Next slide, please. And then a fifth and really problematic assumption is that the policy will be beneficial to children and to family stability. So the impact assessment for the 2-child limit says the proposed changes enhance the life chances of children as they ensure that households make choices based on their circumstances rather than on taxpayers. And also that the policy could have a positive effect on overall family stability. But because of the mismatch between the assumptions around fertility decision making, because people don't make the decisions in the way the government expects, and it's not always a decision, it just means that over 1 million children are now living in households affected by the policy with really serious and harmful consequences Wendy so clearly told us about. Alicia also talks about this. She says, it put me under pressure to try and rush my younger one's potty training, which is clearly not ready. He's not getting there, but I can't afford nappies, so it's stressing me out. I don't have money at the end of the month. I have to make ends meet. I have to sell things. I have to do whatever I can. And as well as these material impacts, there can also be emotional impacts. So Laura talks about how she's really under a lot of stress because of the policy. And as much as parents try to protect their children from knowing about this financial stress, how she says her oldest picks up on the fact that there's money worries and I'm struggling and I'm worried about finances. And in terms of family stability, Kadra actually attributed the breakdown of her marriage due to the financial difficulty she and her husband were facing, and part of that was the two-child limit, and it was also the losing work through the pandemic. Next slide, please. So overall, the two-child limits results in a really significant reduction in entitlement, and this is an attempt to influence fertility decisions. And the case of the two-child limit really shows how problematic trying to change behaviour can be, because of course the decision whether or not to have another child is such a personal one, and to try and intervene with that really goes against reproductive justice. And as Wendy pointed out, of course it's not all of society the government is targeting here in terms of fertility decisions, it's those in or at risk of poverty. So despite this attempt to try and alter fertility decisions, we actually find that the benefit cut has only had a very small impact on fertility. And as I've explained, the qualitative research helps to explain this because of the unplanned pregnancies, changes in circumstances, the different bases of fertility decisions. And then of course, there's also the low awareness of the policy. This might improve over time, but we don't think it'll ever be complete because of how complex the benefit system is. So ultimately, the findings suggest that the main function of the two-child limit is not behaviour change, but instead it's increases in poverty. And of course, this is a huge problem because poverty in larger families was already increasing before the policies were introduced, before the two-child limit was introduced. And as we can see from the qualitative research, the two-child limit is already doing really significant harm to affected families, and this has really worrying implications for children's long-term outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating and beautifully presented as well. I love the illustrations. No, that was brilliant. Thanks to Kate and Mary. And so next up, we're going to have Professor Sharon Wright, from the University of Glasgow, who will draw on her research into the problems with welfare conditionality and benefit sanctions. Over to you, Sharon.
Thanks, Anoosh. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so I wanted to consider the big picture of conditional welfare in the punitive era. I've been researching these issues pretty much since 2013 in terms of welfare conditionality and looking at the impact of sanctions and support on social security claimants' behaviour, and the question of, do changes actually do anything to people's behaviour, and what are the impacts? Are those positive or are those harmful? And I know that many of you will be aware of the research, especially from this first project here, which was a huge collaborative project with 6 universities, which found that sanctions in the sanction system was not ethical and it was not effective, and that benefit sanctions had really serious negative impacts on people who are claiming benefits. At the moment, I'm developing this further, looking particularly at gender and women and welfare conditionality. So that fits very nicely with some of the discussion that we've already had from Wendy and from Kate especially. I'm also drawing here on another project funded by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation about universal credit in Glasgow, and then my current work, which is about migrant essential workers in the UK. and this is my overall conclusion on the matter, does welfare change behaviour? Well, what we've got is an enormous stick and a tiny carrot, and the carrot has been nibbled away. So if you think, well, what is the carrot in this scenario in terms of the changes we've seen, particularly since 2010 to the social security system? What is the carrot? Is it paid work? What's the carrot in terms of the 2-child limit? Is it benefit income? Whichever it is, it's been really diminished, and what remains is an enormous system that's orientated towards punishing people, punishing millions of people by impoverishing them, increasing the risks of destitution, increasing housing insecurity, an enormous rise in food bank use, and putting people in really precarious situations that the risks of that are much higher now than before. So that raises the question, what's this really about? What's the big picture? Is it about conditionality? Is it about changing people's behaviour? Or is it just about making an enormous cut to social support? Is it just about pulling back the welfare system and changing the relationship between the state and citizens? Peter Dwyer talked about this back in the 90s and early 2000s as a process of creeping conditionality. And then my joint work with him in 2014 acknowledged that universal credit brought a new sort of watershed in terms of conditionality then being ubiquitous. So that in order to claim financial support from the state, people must do something behaviourally. And what the type of conditionality I'm talking about here is to do with universal credit, and the main requirement is for people to look for paid work and to increase their hours of work. That also happened at the same time as a huge punitive turn in the whole welfare system that accompanied very significant cuts to the welfare system. What I'm arguing is that we should judge the system as a whole, and universal credit in particular, according to what it does rather than what is said about it. And if you look at universal credit from that point of view and the wider system, what we can see is that it rewrites women's citizenship rights and responsibilities in a way that emphasises work over unpaid care and really curtails people's ability to engage in unpaid care work, which is central to human life and it's central to the functioning of a healthy society. Another major aspect of reforms, particularly since 2010, is to disguise disability and to pull back entitlements to disability benefits. And universal credit serves that purpose by disguising disability and invalidating mental health problems. So I'll give you an example just to illustrate what I mean here. In the welfare conditionality study, Sarah was an in-work universal credit claimant. So she had a job working in security on large events. But her life was very much intertwined with that of the other women in her family, her mum, her sister, who she helped a lot, and her nan. So she says, my mum has mental health issues and she's sectioned, meaning she's detained under the Mental Health Act every year. When my mum is poorly and my nan's been poorly, then we found out my sister's got diabetes. So all of them with health problems. They don't understand at the job centre. They said it's not relevant. I should be searching for work, not looking after my mum. I've been in and out of hospital for operations, and then every month with my universal credit up and down, it was constantly a worry. Am I getting paid? Am I going to get evicted? And that was a huge concern for a lot of people, was that housing insecurity and that fear of being evicted. So Sarah says, I had so many sanctions, they amounted to about £2,000 in total, and I didn't know what they were for. So that's similar to what Kate's just been telling us about the 2-child limit. People don't know what the sanctions were for, so how could they make any conscious or deliberate behaviour decisions in relation to them? She's losing more than £10 a day. She says, I think it's a bit brutal. It's just a few days, and before you know it, it's £40, £50 come off your money. It's just that stopping you either getting gas or your food, because the money that they send to you, it's not even enough, really. It knocks you down and it wears you out. So it does have an effect, but it's not a behavioural effect in the sense that it would be assumed that people would try harder to find work. It had a detrimental mental health effect, and it made it much harder to be able to make any constructive change. So more widely, universal credit overwrites care. So this sort of fake idea that it's about behaviour change is doing something really important in relation to the sort of fabric of our society. An interesting group here are women aged 60 plus who are subject to universal credit and have to look for full-time work 35 hours per week. These are a group of women who lived their working lives in a very constrained way pre-equalities legislation. So one woman that we spoke to had lost her first job when she got pregnant. That was before equal opportunities legislation came in the 1970s. So these women have been constrained all through their working lives, and then the retirement ages changed. So they'd expected to be retired by the time they're in their 60s, but are now having to look for full-time work instead. And that impacts on their ability to care for their grandchildren, which has a knock-on effect for their daughter's employment. And this was a group of women who were pushed into multiple low-paid jobs. So the sort of the knock-on effect of this broad, blunt idea that making people look for work full-time will increase employment rates is having a different impact in terms of constraining people's ability for care. The other really important piece of the big picture that we need to understand is that universal credit is playing a major role in disqualifying disability. So here, this is from the Universal Credit in Glasgow project, where we spoke to work coaches who said, claimants have been engaged with medical services, psychiatrists, doctors, specialists and surgeons for years, and they're still not well. But I'm a work coach. What difference am I going to make just because they've been kicked off ESA and made to claim universal credit? Another work coach said, yeah, the amount of people with serious mental health issues presenting themselves now, what can you do with them? I mean, we've all been sent on mental health training and that, but when they actually sit down in front of you, you just look at them and you think, you shouldn't be here. So what's happening is that universal credit is playing a really important role in invalidating mental health problems. One claimant told us, I said to my work coach, I've just been given more medication. I said, I'm not thinking straight. My work coach said, but I can't treat you like I need to treat you fit for work. And this is the narrative that everyone must be fit for work. And that's the behaviour change that these broader policy reforms are intending to achieve. But what it's actually doing is forcing people to look for work when they are not medically fit for work. And it's applying intensive work conditionality to people with mental health problems on a very large scale. That includes people with severe conditions and those receiving medical treatment. We also found in that project that people were waiting for up to a year for work capability assessments. And during the time that they were waiting, the intensive work conditionality was applied as if they were well, which is another fictional aspect of this behaviour change narrative. So my basic point here is that the discussion about carrots, sticks, nudges is a bit of a red herring. The big picture actually is that the system is being reformed to push people into work and to make enormous cuts that are putting millions of people into poverty and high risks of destitution. So it's not a nudge or a carrot or a stick. It's a huge, great shove. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and for those illustrative images as well. That was brilliant. And last of our panelists, and then we'll open up to questions, Professor Alan Deacon, who is an emeritus professor of social policy at the University of Leeds. Alan will reflect on the rapid changes in social security policy since the 80s and how his own view on conditionality has shifted over time. Thank you so much, Alan. You're on mute, Alan.
That just illustrates the point I was making. It's the first time I've done one of these for a bit, so if I'm a bit rusty, I apologise in advance. What I've been asked to do is to reflect briefly on the debates around conditionality in the 80s, 90s and the early New Labour period. What was expected of conditionality at that time? What arguments were put forward to justify it? And what, if any, is the relevance of those debates by now? Well, as we've already heard, conditionality in essence is requiring that claimants to benefits and services meet specific requirements regarding their conduct. The purpose of welfare is not solely or even primarily to provide income, but to shape behaviour. At the time, there was a crucial distinction between what was seen as two forms of conditionality. One was conditionality which was designed essentially to get people off the welfare rolls. And this was the US, seen as the US model. It was indifferent to the fate of those who left welfare or were deterred from applying for welfare. And the criteria for success was, did it get the numbers off welfare? And the US welfare reform of 1996 was enormously successful in that specific objective. This is seen as in contrast to a more positive conception of welfare, which was designed, of conditionality, which was designed to improve people's lives. And the central criteria would be, did it lead to reductions in poverty? Did it lead to reductions in self-damaging behaviours, and so on? And the other point I need to make at the very beginning is that the major way this was supposed to work was getting people into paid work. There were always people who challenged this. There were always, for example, large families for whom work did not offer a way out of poverty. But that was nothing like the situation where we have now, a situation in which 3/4 of children in poverty or in working households would have been inconceivable. It requires something of an act of intellectual imagination to get back to the debates of the late 90s, the early New Labour period, in terms of the expectations around paid work, lower unemployment, minimum wage, and so on. And the other point, in a sense, to make at the outset, is that all this is talking about what was expected of conditionality. Very little of it had been actually introduced. There were very little measures of what it had actually done. In a sense, it was an evidence-free debate. There was relatively little evidence on whether it worked or not, and it was a debate which assumed that if you pulled the right levers, then the right consequences would happen. So in that context, what were the kind of arguments that were put forward to justify conditionality? And in the light of what you've just heard, some of this might become something of a health warning for your collective blood pressure, but essentially there were three. The first and most simple was the contractualist argument. If governments did their bits, if it creates opportunities, then there was a reciprocal obligation on claimants to take advantage of those opportunities. What constituted the government's bit was a subject of a huge debate. Stuart White wrote a brilliant book called The Civic Minimum in, I think it was 2003, trying to establish what threshold of provision would justify conditionality. IPPR, Social Market Foundation, the Fabians, they all had conferences, pamphlets galore on what would, in a sense, constitute an appropriate threshold. Of course, it's a debate of its time, and it's really of very little relevance to contemporary policies, except to note that this justification rested in the sense on the economic, quote, economic man model. It talked about rational actors taking decisions, pursuing their own self-interest, responding to incentives, which is a quite different rationale to the other two. The second justification at the time was paternalistic. To a paternalist, long-term poor in particular are not rational actors. They are, in Larry Mead's phrase, the dutiful but defeated. They don't respond to incentives, but they will respond to help and hassle, a combination of help and hassle. The government knows what's best for them, and the government is entitled to coerce, compel them into behaving in appropriate ways. Now, this demands a lot of public agencies. It's a big government solution. So there was a huge division within conservative thought on welfare at this time between people like Charles Murray, who basically wanted to slash and burn, cut the benefit levels, leave people basically on charity, and Mead and others who were countenancing large-scale bureaucracies to effectively exercise this kind of salient surveillance and control. The third justification is a bit more complicated. It's hard to overestimate the influence on New Labour of communitarianism and Christian socialism. The talk of rights and obligations was everywhere. Of course, communitarians and especially Christian socialists didn't simply talk about welfare, but there was a core idea that communities could collectively establish the common good, and in Ezione's words, articulate the responsibilities they expect their members to discharge. Now, those responsibilities didn't stem from any contract with government, they stemmed from the network of involvements and commitment of socially embedded individuals. And it's worth noting in brackets, because that's all there is I have time for, but there were quite important commonalities in this debate between communitarianism and some of the feminist theories of an ethic of care. And people like Eva Fedekite wrote very interestingly about the relationship between the two. Now, it's fair to say that some of the attempts made to justify conditionality in the light of the ethic of care introduced a level of apoplexy in part of some of the care theorists, but it was still a debate that was taking place. It was interesting, but in a sense, another reality. In one way, it's easy to see what's happened, because if you have a structure, if you have a program, if you have a can with a label on it, it's not politically or administratively difficult to change the structures, to change the pattern of incentives within that. It's not difficult to make the conditions more demanding, to make the sanctions harsher, and so on. And equally, it's not difficult to extend the scope of those programs to include people with disabilities, people in part-time work, and in that way extend conditionality, which doesn't look that different from the outside. And this paralleled, particularly after 2010, George Osborne's way in which simply by technical changes in the level of tapers, thresholds, benefit freezes, the social security system could take huge amounts of money off poor families without really many headline policies. And in a sense, the tightening of conditionality followed that pattern. In fairness, you would have to say it probably started around 2007, 2008 with the Secretary of State called John Houghton, this process of intensification. I suppose the question that arises is how far should those who debated conditionality in the early years and were relatively sympathetic to it in the early years have anticipated this? Some people are entitled to say, I told you so. I remember witnessing a ferocious argument at an American conference between a guy called David Elwell, who in 1988 wrote an absolutely brilliant book called Full Support, which is a contractualist book, but it envisaged time limits on welfare benefits. And he later worked in the Clinton administration. And the person arguing with him was Frances Fox Pippin, who with her husband, Richard Cloward, had written a book called Regulating the Poor, and was a passionate critic of this. And what Cliven was saying is, I don't care what qualifications you've got, I don't care what thresholds you want, you've let the genie out the bottle. Once governments can start doing this, the Republicans will make hell of it. And I think she's probably entitled to say she was right. And that's a very, difficult question. But finally, I would come back, in a sense, in tension with that, to the final point, which is that I don't think it necessarily follows that the implications of what you've heard is that you just throw everything out. if you go back to the original debates, people like William Julius Wilson, who was one of the leading American opponents of Charles Murray right at the very beginning, said time and time again, we left this field to the far right. Murray, Charles Meade had an open field at the time because they were talking about issues that the left didn't go anywhere near. And that was extremely damaging in the long term. So anyway, I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Alan. That was really interesting. And thanks to all of our panelists for their opening remarks. And now I think we're going to go to questions. So please do type questions into the chat. And if you have a particular question for a particular person, do let me know. So I think we've got a couple of questions here from 2 questions from the same person. I think this is an interesting one from Snow Curtis Kolu. What do the different perceptions of furlough versus universal credit tell us about aims around behavioural change and conditionality? So I think that's a really interesting question because, of course, the furlough scheme was really a welfare scheme, really, but it didn't have that sort of conditionality built into it. Is there anyone that wasn't aimed at anyone in particular, but would anyone like to pick that one up first? Mary, I could see you nodding there. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just think it's a really interesting question. I don't know if I have a huge amount to offer, but I think the interesting thing about furlough was that it was in very many ways pitched and framed as a more universal kind of social insurance model, which very much contrasts with the sort of social assistance-based, means-tested system that we have in place. And I think one of the interesting things about that is that, you know, it was hugely popular because it had sort of universal benefit for a wide swathe of people across society. And that has interesting implications, you know, how do you safeguard welfare policies in the future? There's that, you know, famous quote that, you know, if benefits are just for poor people, then they become kind of poor benefits in the sense that they get devalued because there's no kind of middle class support for them. So I think that's really interesting. And yeah, definitely also an area where conditionality and behaviour change was not part of the policy aim of furlough. It was very much just about, you know, smoothing income.
Thank you. No, that was really interesting. Would anyone else like to come in on the furlough comparison? No, okay, so let's go to our next question, which is for Alan, actually, from, oh no, it's not, sorry, getting a bit confused here. Another question from Kitty Stewart. Great presentations from everyone, interesting comments from Alan about the historical context and background. Oh, sorry, this question is for Alan. You warned against chucking all of this out at the risk of ceding ground to the right. Could you say a bit more about what you see as the alternatives? What would you suggest in terms of moving forward?
Oh Lord, I walked into that one, didn't I? Yeah, I said I was rusty. I think there was, it's very difficult to, in a sense, instantly propose an approach which meets the kind of criticisms that Sharon or the evidence that Sharon and so on has provided. I think the one central error, and this is partly an answer to the question, was to expect far too much of public agencies. There is evidence that certain types of very limited forms of welfare conditionality can be implemented in positive ways and can have good consequences. I mean, back in the day, the Dundee Family Project was one, but it requires an enormous investment in the bureaucracy, in the provision of the services. It requires an enormous investment in the people providing those services. So there isn't an easy answer. There's a negative answer, which is quite easy because you can, you know, one thing that the elephant in the room is the level of benefit. It's just so straightforward and so obvious that levels of benefit should be much higher, and that the vast majority of their sanctions, which are totally unjustified and so on. So there's a negative withdrawing of many of the changes that have happened in the last few years. But positively, if you had to sort of pick where could conditionality work, there is some evidence. There's a wonderful book by Beth Watts and Suzanne Fitzpatrick called Welfare Conditionality, which I think came out in about 2017. And they very carefully pick through specific areas in relation to long-term homeless men, families, where properly invested, properly administered forms of conditionality can work. And I wouldn't want to kind of completely disavow all of that, as did happen in the 60s and 70s. Sorry, that's a bit of a garbled answer, but it isn't an easy one.
Anoosh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I've lost the screen. But I do have the questions in front of me. We have one from an anonymous attendee. Do you have views on the move away from conditionality on other welfare payments, particularly taxing back child benefit on those earning over 50k? This would seem to have a reduced impact on low-income households, but does represent a move from social insurance / universality. I can't actually see anyone's faces at the moment, so I'm just going to try and get back to the screen. But if someone could come in on that question, that would be.
Anoosh, I can come in. It's Sharon. I also wanted to say something about Alan's last question as well, about alternatives to conditionality, because, and I think these two questions are kind of connected, because if we say, okay, so behaviour change doesn't work and can be very harmful, and there's a lot of evidence about that, then what should we do instead? So the options are to do something universal, like child benefit always was in the past, which I would definitely, that gets my vote. Should we expand on that universal theme, maybe with a universal basic income? And that's there's some exciting developments on that front in Wales, or something similar like in Scotland. The Scottish government are currently looking at a minimum income guarantee. So rather than saying people have to behave in any particular way, there will just be payments made that are not conditional on work. Or should we go back to the more traditional idea of having a two-tier social security system that has insurance-based benefits that are connected to work, or assistance-based benefits that are designed to make sure everybody is kept out of poverty? I think there are a lot of options, and it is worth confirming what Alan was saying about we don't need to just think of conditionality or behaviour change as just how we know it in the UK. I noticed that there's some colleagues that are participating just now who are in countries like Denmark, for example. If benefits are paid more generously, if there's a much better system of support to help people, then maybe conditionality can be seen in different ways. So what we've been talking about is one particular, or a couple of different examples of behaviour change within a really, really punitive system that has benefits that are set well below poverty rates and have been reduced further and further and further. So what we are seeing is one version of doing things, not every possible solution. Yeah, so to answer that second question, I would certainly be supportive of universal child benefits, because it's for the child, it's not for the adult. So it doesn't matter what the adult earns, that money's for the child.
Brilliant answer, thank you. And we have a question for Wendy. How do we shift what the public think about the 2-child limit? Wendy, do you have any thoughts about that, and also about how the 2-child limit has been framed in terms of the way that politicians talk about it, for example?
Yeah, I mean, the way the politicians talk about it and the way they talk about people on benefits in general is disgusting, and you are the scum of the earth. And media has a huge role to play in this. You know, people are on benefits for loads of different reasons. They're not scroungers. They're not people who go out and buy beer and fags and, you know, just live in squalor. They are normal, everyday people that have found themselves in a position where they need financial help. And like I said, the media needs to change its attitude around how it deals with people on benefits, how it deals with larger families. Instead of slapping them on the front page of the Sun newspaper and saying, scrounging mum of 8 gets this amount in benefits. Look at what that mum does for her children. Look at what she does for her community. Look beyond, the initial headline. And that's what we need to change. And until that changes, nothing else will change.
Thank you so much. Very well put. And this is one for anyone. Does the panel think that the government will use the current state of the labour market as a justification for ratcheting up conditionality further? Who wants to come in on that one? Sharon, you've got your hand up. You go.
Yeah, fantastic question. But what is the current state of the labour market? So obviously there have been huge issues with the pandemic, and there are lots of things that need to be addressed in the long term. But when you look at just the bare statistics, unemployment is actually at a record low, and employment is about as high as it's ever been in the history since records began. So I think that's also a bit of a red herring in terms of, it's easy, I think, for people to make assumptions about how the labour market is or what the problems are without really looking at the statistics about it. That's not a criticism on the person who asked that question, by the way, not at all. But what I mean is that policies or policy responses can be justified according to impressions that people have rather than the data about what is actually happening. And I think it's incredibly important that we look at the data and we also look at people's lived experiences, because part of the problem with behaviour change policies, conditionality, is that it's based on assumptions about how people behave rather than looking in detail in a serious way at how people actually behave, what motivates people, what doesn't motivate people, what impacts the measures have. If we started to do that, then the situation could be greatly improved. In Universal Credit, for example, they said they had a test and learn approach, but one thing that was never tested was not applying sanctions, just having a conditionality free approach. So certainly that would be one place to start.
Thank you. And one for Kate and Mary. If we take the government at its word and accept that the 2-child limit is not intended to reduce fertility, then presumably the only available interpretation is that the limit is intended to push people into work. But how feasible is it for parents to support third and additional children through work, given the expense of childcare and low wages, etc.? And is there any research you can point to which addresses that issue? Kate, do you want to come in on that first?
Yeah, just to say I really agree with that it's incredibly difficult for the participants in our study to get into paid work on account of the fact that they are looking after multiple children. So it's such a problematic policy because it's trying to make you do something that's almost impossible and then putting in such a severe and long-lasting punishment if you can't do that. And I think there's two, it kind of relates to what Sharon said and also Wendy's talked about is how that then really devalues the unpaid care work and the huge contributions that the people are carrying out. So it's, to me, it's a kind of a bit of a misplaced policy or priority, this push to get everybody in paid work.
Great. And Mary, do you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, 100% agree with Kate. I also think even taking, if you take the government at face value, if you were going to design a work incentives policy, you would not design 2-child limit. It's a very, very blunt instrument to achieve that role. But putting that aside, let's assume it is. 56% of people affected by the 2-child limit are in work. So the idea that, and this relates to Sharon's work on UCN and work conditionality, the idea that this is going to suddenly push everybody into work is a fallacy. That we're actually doing some research right now at the moment about the employment effect of the 2-child limit, and that's not been published yet, but the kind of findings we're having so far are that there's basically no effect on employment, which really isn't very surprising when you speak to people, because taking £3,000 away from a family per child isn't going to suddenly cause them to turn to work. It's just going to make their life a lot harder. And you could even argue through the mental health effects and the wider repercussions, make it harder to get into the labour market, especially when you have 3 or more children.
That's so interesting. And I do remember in one slide where it part of the cause for a relationship breakdown was the financial pressure that was caused by the 2-child limit as well, which could of course make it harder for a mother to work. We have a question specifically for Alan here, an interesting one. One of your last remarks that it was the far right talking about the issues that the left won't go anywhere near is very relevant to the current political context. Labour doesn't seem to be engaging in the mainstream media with the idea that improvements to social security system can be a valid solution to the current cost of living crisis. Why do you think this is, if you do agree with that premise?
Right. Well, first of all, to clarify what I was referring to. What I was referring to before was the kind of, it was argued, the vacuum which was created by a collective reluctance to be seen to be blaming the victim. There was huge sensitivities, particularly in the US, about changes in the Black family. And this meant that there was initially a backing off from those debates. I think that's a huge stretch to get from there to current Labour Party policies. I think there's clearly, and one of the things we haven't talked about a great deal about is public opinion, attitudes towards welfare and so on. You would expect that there would be an easing of them. I mean, if you go back, the classic period was the 1940s, where during the war, unemployment totally disappeared. There were 7 people registered as unemployed in Greater London in the old LCC in 1944. And there was a huge sort of recognition that so-called unemployables had all found purposive employment and so on during the war. So you would expect in some ways the present period to be less punitive. And you would also expect, there must be some people who are twitchy at the current levels of labour shortages and the number of people who appear to have retired early and the number of people on invalidity benefit. And I'm sure there are some on the right looking at that. But those are not the groups that it's easy to hit politically. The people who are early retired are by definition the older. They're people to which the present government is generally sympathetic. To come back to the Labour Party question, I don't know. This is where I come back to, I have not got a clue. This is probably the most honest answer you're going to get on one of these webinars. What I would do if I was the shadow spokesman for Social Security. There are other people here who are much better qualified to answer that question. I don't think at the moment there is a great nervousness around the issue that parallel to the one I was referring to in the 60s and 70s. So no, I think probably Sharon and the others have got a better answer to what should Labour be doing.
Does anyone want to come in on what Labour should be doing before we move on to our last question? No. Okay. We'll have to see. What's interesting, and this is something that we've been discussing at the New Statesman a bit on our podcast, is that their current welfare policy is to scrap universal credit still, which was a policy under Jeremy Corbyn as well. But they haven't said what they would put in its place. So at the moment, they don't have a social security policy at all. So I think we'll need to wait for closer to a general election to see what they come up with. But it certainly isn't featuring in their rhetoric very highly at the moment on the cost of living crisis stuff.
Anoosh, you're on mute suddenly.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. We have time for one more question before we move to our last poll. And I think this would be good to hear from Wendy about. The voice of claimants is missing from a lot of the debate. How can claimants' views be better heard? And I do have to say it has been brilliant to have you on the panel, Wendy, to illustrate all of these issues. So do you want to come in on that?
I think making studies like this more widely known about. I was contacted through a third party about this, And again, the way media perceives people on benefits is, you know, they're stupid, they're not worth anything. That needs to change. You know, I'm a clever person, I worked in a school, my circumstances have put me where I am today. And it's the people's perception needs to change, and there needs to be a more accessible thing for people to be able to join groups like Ruth's and that, so you can discuss the impact and discuss it without fear of being splashed all over the media, because that's the big thing when we talk to people about moving house, and I'm like, no, I don't want to move house because I don't want to be that person. And you know, that is a huge fear for a lot of people. I know people who've got lots of children who struggle, but struggle quietly and just get on with things because the alternative is being made out to be scum of the earth and even more worthless than you already feel on benefits. So yeah, I think I've kind of answered that. There needs to be more discussion and it more readily available rather than the door just shut.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. I think more events like these and more projects like Ruth's would be brilliant to have. And thank you so much for participating. And I have been told that if there are any more burning questions that we didn't get to, we can try and answer them if you get in contact with us afterwards, especially those two, the people on the benefit changes and larger families team. But now over to Ruth for our final poll of the session.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, it's always kind of the consequence of a good session and a good, amazing presentation from all of you that we've got more questions than we can possibly respond to. So we will try and get back to those that we didn't get to in the Q&A. So we now have one final poll, and technology is not letting me launch it, but I think Lizzie is more sophisticated technology-wise than I am. So I think, Lizzie, if you can launch it, and then I just do. And I think, I don't know, so panelists can tell me, but I tried to press a button that meant that you could actually vote on this one. So I don't know, I don't know if that worked or not. You can, yeah, you're nodding. So I've given you a special end of webinar thing that the panelists can vote as well. And just to flag that this is like a multiple choice question. So you can add multiple, you can choose more than one option if you think it should do more things at once. And I'm just going to speak over it like while it comes in, so that we're not all just in silence. So just as it comes in, just to say a really big thank you, to everyone, and especially thanks, because I guess you can't thank yourself, Anoosh, but thank you to Anoosh for chairing the webinar, which you've done really amazingly, and again to Nuffield Foundation for funding it, and to all the speakers. So we've got, you guys are indecisive, you're still thinking, so we've got about 2/3 that have voted, so I'll keep I'll keep it going for a few seconds longer. And also just to flag that you can keep in touch with the projects. We've got a project website, which is www.largerfamilies.study, and there you can find working papers for the fertility work that Kate and Mary presented today. I haven't got full, I think somebody said they can't see it. Sometimes people can't see it if you're joining on your phone, that makes it harder. So I'm going to end the poll now and share it so that we keep time. So what you'll see is that the results of the poll are quite, I guess, resounding, is that the right word? So that we found that very few people felt that efforts to change the behaviour through social security can have beneficial outcomes in the current context, only 2%. And the largest percent, 89%, felt that they increased poverty and hardship, with 79% thinking that they caused more harm than good. So I will stop sharing that, and then we can, I don't know, Anoosh, if you just want to wrap things up, and then we're done.
Yes, thank you so much. Interesting polling results as well there. And what I want to do actually is re-watch this when it's up on the website, because I want to go back and look at the slides for longer as well. It's been really rich with information. It's been brilliant. So thank you so much to all of our panelists. You've all given unique perspectives and great insights into this important discussion. I think we should keep this discussion up. And thank you, Ruth, as well.
And we'll try and put the slides up on our project website if everyone agrees, so we'll be in touch, but there should be slides and recordings up online. So take care, everybody.